The sound of the heart monitor was the only rhythm in the room, a fragile reminder that my wife was still fighting to hold on. The slow, steady beeps carried both comfort and terror, each one marking another second of survival. I remember the sterile smell of antiseptic, the low hum of machines, and the way the fluorescent lights overhead seemed far too bright for a place that felt so heavy with fear. My wife's face was pale, her skin almost translucent under the sheets, and her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. She looked fragile in a way I had never seen before, a stark contrast to the strong, loving woman I had built a life with. I felt powerless, sitting there by her side, clinging to her hand as though my grip alone might tether her to this world. Then the door opened, and with it entered the one person I least expected to see at such a vulnerable moment. Karen. For months, she had been the source of endless conflict in our neighborhood. HOA fines, petty arguments, complaints about everything from the color of our fence to the way we parked our car. She thrived on making life miserable. I thought I had seen the worst of her on our street, but nothing prepared me for what she did in that hospital room. She didn't belong there, yet she walked in with the entitlement of someone who thought every place, every situation should bend to her control. She looked at my wife, hooked up to the monitor, and instead of pity or concern, I saw something darker in her eyes, a flash of satisfaction, almost like she wanted to prove that even here, in a hospital where lives hung by a thread, she could still assert her dominance. Before I could say a word, before I could even process why she had shown up, she moved toward the machines. Her hand reached for the monitor cable with a casualness that chilled me to my core. Then, without hesitation, she yanked it free. The steady beeping that had been both my lifeline and my torment cut to silence. A shrill alarm blared through the room, the kind of sound that rips through your chest and makes your blood run cold. My wife stirred weakly, her lips parting as if to call for me, but no sound came out. My heart stopped with that monitor, every ounce of fear and rage crashing down at once. I lunged forward, shouting, but by then the chaos had already begun. Nurses burst into the room, their shoes squeaking against the polished floor, voices sharp and urgent as they tried to stabilize the situation. I could barely breathe as I watched them scramble, plugging cords back in, checking vitals, calling for backup, and through it all, Karen stood there with a mask of innocence stretched over her smug face, feigning ignorance, acting as though she had no idea what she had just done. She even shrugged, muttering something about accidents happen, but I knew better. This was no accident. It was deliberate, calculated, and cruel. In that moment, with alarms blaring and my wife's fragile life hanging by a thread, I realized that Karen had crossed a line that no one could ever come back from. She thought she had gotten away with it. She thought no one would ever believe me. But she was wrong. Because what Karen didn't know was that I had everything on camera, and one day the world would see it. Long before that night in the hospital, Karen had already made herself the nightmare of our neighborhood. When my wife and I bought our home, it felt like a dream come true, a peaceful cul-de-sac, neatly trimmed lawns, the kind of quiet community where you thought your children could ride their bikes safely, and neighbors might wave as you passed. But underneath the polished veneer of our homeowners association, there was rot, and its name was Karen. She had lived in the neighborhood for years, long enough to insert herself into the HOA leadership and convince herself she was the queen of the block. Rules, regulations, fines, those were her weapons, and she wielded them with ruthless precision. At first, I thought she was simply strict, maybe too passionate about keeping the neighborhood orderly. But it became clear very quickly that her actions weren't about order, they were about control. She fined us for leaving our garbage cans at the curb for an extra hour, even though we had been delayed coming home from work. She sent angry letters about the color of our shutters, claiming they disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the street. She even complained about the flowers my wife planted in the front yard, insisting that they weren't approved varieties for our community. Every interaction felt less like neighborly guidance and more like harassment. The worst part was that she never targeted everyone equally. Some families she left alone, Usually those who fawned over her at HOA meetings or whispered about her behind closed doors, but never dared confront her. Others, like us, became her obsession. My wife and I were younger than many of the homeowners, new blood in a place where Karen had cemented her power. I think she resented that we didn't bow to her authority, that we rolled our eyes when she tried to scold us like children. That resentment grew into something poisonous. It wasn't just about the fines or the letters. Karen was skilled at turning the community against people. She spread rumors with a sly smile, pretending she was concerned about us. Once, I overheard her telling a neighbor that we were behind on HOA dues, which wasn't true, and that maybe we weren't responsible homeowners. She thrived on the whispers, the judgmental looks, the way gossip could isolate a family without a single piece of evidence. It was like she was testing how far she could push us before we broke. My wife tried to keep her head high, but I could see the toll it was taking. She dreaded checking the mail because there was always another notice, another fine, another complaint. She started worrying that neighbors believed the lies Karen spread. Even when we were inside her home, we felt her presence, like a shadow lingering over the neighborhood. There were times I'd catch her walking slowly past our house, staring for too long, her phone in hand as if she were documenting every imagined infraction. It didn't feel like community oversight anymore, it felt like stalking. The breaking point came when my wife got sick. She had been struggling with health issues for a while, but Karen showed no compassion. Instead, she escalated her harassment. We received fines for not mowing the lawn quickly enough, even though I was spending most of my time taking care of my wife and shuttling her to doctor's appointments. Karen went so far as to make a scene at an HOA meeting, loudly questioning whether we even belonged in a neighborhood like this if we couldn't keep up appearances. I remember gripping the edge of my chair, my blood boiling as she smirked, knowing exactly what she was doing, trying to humiliate us publicly. Looking back, I realized Karen's obsession with us wasn't about rules or appearances. It was about power. She needed to feel superior, to crush anyone who dared live outside of her rigid idea of control. And in her twisted mind, my wife's illness became another opportunity to assert herself, to show that she could dominate us even when we were at our weakest. When my wife was finally admitted to the hospital, I thought maybe we'd get a break from Karen's constant harassment. I thought surely even she would recognize that there are limits, that there are moments when you put aside petty grievances because a family is in crisis. But Karen didn't see limits. She saw an opportunity. To her, our suffering wasn't something to leave in peace, it was something to exploit. She wanted to prove that no matter where we were, even in the sanctuary of a hospital, her presence loomed over us. And that twisted desire for control would soon drive her to commit the most reckless, heartless act of all, the one that nearly cost my wife her life. The day my wife was admitted to the hospital is etched into my memory like a scar I can't forget. It had been building for weeks, her health steadily declining, the doctors becoming more concerned with every appointment, the sleepless nights where I sat by her bedside, praying for strength I wasn't sure I had. By the time she was finally wheeled into that sterile white room, attached to IVs and monitors, I felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. Fear that her body might give out, and relief that at least now she was in a place where professionals could help. I thought, foolishly, that here she would be safe. The hospital smelled of bleach and faint medicine, a sterile odor that clung to your clothes. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor became my anchor, a fragile comfort, reminding me that my wife was still fighting. I sat in a hard plastic chair by her bedside, holding her hand, whispering words I hoped pierced the fog of her half-conscious state. Nurses came and went, doctors scribbled notes, but in the chaos of my exhaustion, there was still a sense of order. I clung to the belief that in this place of healing, no harm could come. And then the door opened. The sound was ordinary, a creak of hinges, a click of the handle. But the sight of her standing there froze me. Karen. She didn't belong in that room, didn't belong in the hospital at all, yet she walked in with the entitled air of someone who thought rules were for other people. She wasn't family. She wasn't a friend. She wasn't even welcome. She was our tormentor, our neighbor, our HOA tyrant, and now, inexplicably, she was here. Her eyes flicked to my wife on the bed, then to the machines, and I swear in that fleeting glance, I saw something sinister. Not concern, not pity, not even morbid curiosity, something darker, like satisfaction. She smirked faintly, as though she had stumbled into a moment she could use to remind us she still had power over our lives. My throat tightened, my instinct screamed to tell her to leave, but the weight of shock pinned me to the chair. Karen stepped closer to the monitor, her fingers brushing the cord as if she were merely curious. "So many wires," she said casually, her voice carrying that infuriating mix of condescension and false innocence. And before I could stop her, she yanked. The monitor flatlined instantly. The steady beep that had been our lifeline cut into a deafening alarm. My heart stopped with it. My wife stirred weakly, her lips trembling, her chest rising unevenly as if the very act of breathing had become unbearable. I shouted, my voice raw, but my cry was drowned out by the shrill panic of machines. Nurses came rushing in, their shoes squeaking on the polished floor, their voices sharp and commanding. "Reconnect," one shouted, another called for backup, their movements a blur of urgency. I stumbled back against the wall, my head spinning, watching them scramble to reattach cords, check vitals, pump oxygen. And through the chaos, Karen stood there, hands folded, feigning surprise. "It must have come loose," she muttered, her tone dripping with mock innocence. I didn't mean to, but I saw it. I saw the deliberate way her fingers closed around the cord, the certainty with which she pulled. There was no accident here. No misunderstanding. She had unplugged that machine on purpose. Rage boiled inside me, so hot I thought I might combust right there in the room. I wanted to grab her, drag her out, scream until the walls shook. But I couldn't. Not with nurses desperately fighting to stabilize my wife, not with every second mattering. I was rooted in a helpless limbo, torn between fury and fear, my fists clenched so tight my nails cut into my palms. The alarm quieted as the nurses restored the connection. The monitor resumed its rhythm, though slower now, weaker, a fragile line between life and death. My wife lay still, her breathing shallow, her face pale. Relief washed over me in a choking wave, but it was tangled with something sharper, something poisonous, hatred. I turned back toward Karen, and she had the audacity to shrug, as though she were some innocent bystander caught in a misunderstanding. "You should really be more careful," she said, her eyes narrowing just slightly, a flash of that smug superiority breaking through the mask. "Hospitals are stressful enough without all this." I wanted to lunge at her, to scream until security dragged her out, but she slipped away before I could form the words. The door closed behind her, leaving me with the deafening echo of alarm still ringing in my ears and the hollow ache of knowing that Karen had just crossed a line most people could never even fathom. As I stood by my wife's bedside, my chest still heaving, one thought consumed me. No one would believe this. If I told the nurses Karen had deliberately pulled the cord, they'd think I was overreacting, a distraught husband projecting blame. If I told the HOA or the police, she'd twist it into a story about an accident, and somehow she'd come out the victim. Karen was good at manipulation, good at painting herself as the misunderstood neighbor. But what she didn't realize was that this time, I had an advantage she hadn't accounted for. The hospital room was under surveillance, and I had already set up my own small recording device for my wife's safety. Karen thought she could walk away clean, but I knew better. I had proof that she had crossed the line from petty harassment to attempted harm, proof that would one day make her face justice. And as I watched my wife's chest rise and fall, clinging to the fragile reassurance of that restored beeping, I made a silent vow. Karen thought she was untouchable, but I would make sure she paid. She had tried to take the person I loved most from me, and I would not let the world forget what she had done. After the chaos in the hospital, I didn't sleep for days. Sleep felt like surrender. Every second my wife breathed felt like a borrowed mercy I couldn't waste. The first clear thought that cut through the fog of adrenaline and fear was simple and ugly. Karen had to be held accountable. But instinct alone wouldn't be enough. Karen was a master at twisting facts, at playing the martyr to anyone who would listen. If I wanted justice, I needed more than my word and my fury. I needed proof that could not be denied, tamper with, or spin into some clever lie. So I turned every ounce of my panic into action. The hospital had cameras in the halls and on the unit entrances. I knew because I'd noticed the little blinking red lights when we first arrived, the way they tracked movement without ever being obtrusive. I also had something else, something I'd set up before my wife's condition worsened, because a paranoid part of me wanted to know she was always safe when I had to step out. A small pocket recorder clipped to my belt, a phone propped low on a shelf that unfortunately captured much more than I'd intended. That device had recorded visitors' conversations in the hallway and the minute-by-minute soundscape of that room. I clutched that tiny recorder like a lifeline. It was me against Karen's practice performance, and I was determined not to let her rewrite the story. Getting the hospital video wasn't simple. I spent hours on hold with hospital administration, my voice tight, requesting footage like a man asking for permission to breathe. There were privacy rules, bureaucratic forms, and sympathetic clerks who told me they would do their best. The first time I saw the security playback, my stomach dropped and my hands shook. Karen's figure appeared on the grainy video, walking down the corridor with that slow, deliberate pace she used when she wanted attention. The moment she stepped into the doorway, the camera captured the exact seconds I'd replayed in my head 1,000 times. The hand on the monitor, the yank, the pause, the cold look on her face as alarms rose. It was undeniable. The footage did what my words could not. It showed intent. But footage alone wouldn't win a fight against someone who knew how to manipulate systems. Karen had friends on the HOA board. She knew the exact language to make a false complaint sound credible. She could claim she'd tripped, that cables sometimes come loose, that she was merely checking equipment. I needed the chain of custody to be airtight. I needed a lawyer who understood how to turn raw surveillance into courtroom gold. So I called the attorney I'd met once before over a smaller HOA dispute, someone who'd laughed off Karen's theatrics and told me she had a reputation for escalation. He met me in a nondescript office, and when I played him the clip, he didn't look surprised, just coldly efficient. "This is probable cause," he said, "but we do this right. Subpoenas, documented requests, copies verified by an independent third party. No shortcuts." There were legal motions and angry calls. Karen's lawyer, because of course she had won, tried to delay everything, to question the authenticity of the timestamps, to insinuate that my recorder had been edited. She pushed smear campaigns through neighborhood chats, whispering that a desperate husband was trying to ruin a good woman's life. Some neighbors, the ones who had once nodded hello, now avoided us like a contagion. The pressure was relentless. At night, I would back up the original files to 3 separate encrypted drives, email copies to a secure account, and hand a thumb drive to my attorney in person. I printed still frames and logged times to the second. I wrote down the names of nurses who had been present and asked them to give statements. Each administrative task felt like placing a brick in a wall I hoped would keep Karen from escaping responsibility. Emotionally, it was brutal. Obsession creeps in at odd hours, checking email at 2 a.m., replaying the video to make sure I hadn't misremembered a detail, staring at the little red light on the recorder as if it could tell me the future. My wife, when she could talk, feared the fight would hurt her more than help her. I argued that justice could be a bomb, that exposing Karen would protect others. She squeezed my hand and told me to be careful. Her voice was small but steady, and it reminded me that the point of this was to keep her safe, not to demolish someone's life for revenge alone. That kept me tethered to what mattered. There were also moments of cowardice. Once, a neighbor I thought might help warned me that taking Karen to court would tear apart the block, that we'd be ostracized for causing trouble. For one long, cold minute, I pictured a future where we were alone, a family shunned in a place we had once loved. Then I remembered the beeping monitor, my wife's pale face, and the way Karen had shrugged as if unplugging a machine were no more consequential than adjusting a lamp. The choice became clear. As the legal paperwork moved forward and statements piled up, I realized there was one more battle to fight. How to present the footage so that the truth hit like a hammer in the courtroom. Raw surveillance can be grainy, easy to dismiss. So, we had the clip professionally enhanced, timestamps verified by an independent technician, and created a short, unambiguous edit that showed the approach, the pull to reaction, no commentary, no music, no room for spin. It felt clinical and terrifying to watch our worst moment reduced to a looped evidence file, but it was necessary. By the time we were ready to file charges, I had made multiple copies sworn affidavits and a plan with my lawyer to play the footage publicly at the right moment. Even then, I knew this wasn't the end. Getting the footage was only the beginning of a war with Karen, one fought in depositions, in closed-door hearings, and in the court of public opinion. But for the first time since that hospital room, I felt something other than helplessness. I had the proof. I had allies. And I knew exactly how I would use both when the day came to expose her in front of everyone who had ever judged us. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and dust, a place where justice was supposed to be blind, but where truth often fought to be heard. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my palms damp against the cool surface, my heart pounding as though it were preparing for its own trial. Karen sat across the room, head held high, her posture stiff with that familiar arrogance I had come to know all too well. She wore a navy blazer, pearls strung around her neck like a shield, and she smiled faintly at the whispers floating among the spectators. It wasn't the smile of an innocent woman fearing judgment. It was the smug curve of someone who still believed she could manipulate her way out of anything. Her lawyer rose with a confidence that rattled me. He painted her as a misunderstood neighbor, a woman unfairly targeted by an overzealous husband desperate to find a scapegoat for his wife's illness. He called me emotional, paranoid, and vindictive. Each word felt like a stone hurled in my direction, designed to chip away at my credibility. And Karen nodded along, her hands folded neatly in her lap, like she was a schoolteacher tolerating the tantrum of a difficult child. But then it was our turn. My lawyer stood, calm but deliberate, and began to peel back the layers of Karen's carefully constructed mask. He recited the timeline of fines, harassment, rumors, the escalating campaign of control. He showed letters, photographs, testimony from neighbors who had quietly endured her wrath, but had never dared to speak up until now. The room began to shift, whispers changing flavor, curiosity replacing skepticism. Karen's jaw tightened, though she still clung to her veneer of composure. And then the moment came, the heart of the case, the footage. The lights dimmed slightly as the monitor at the front of the room flickered to life. The grainy black and white image of the hospital hallway appeared first, the date and time stamped clearly in the corner. My throat tightened as I watched the familiar scene play out, the door opening, Karen stepping inside, her movements deliberate, confident. Then the angle shifted to the footage from my personal recorder, enhanced just enough to make the act unmistakable. The jury, the judge, the gallery, they all saw it. Karen's hand gripping the cable, the sharp tug, the monitor flatlining. They heard the alarm, saw the chaos begin, watched her stand there without shock or panic, just a calculated stillness that betrayed everything. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The sound was like a physical wave breaking across the benches. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed, his gavel tapping once against the block to restore order. I didn't need to look at the jury to know what they were thinking. The horror on their faces was proof enough. Karen, for the first time, lost her composure. Her lips parted as if to speak, then pressed into a tight line. Her lawyer scrambled, objecting to context, claiming the angle didn't show intent, but his voice cracked with desperation. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the table, tears burning the back of my eyes. Not from sadness, but from the release of months of agony. The truth was no longer locked inside my chest, no longer trapped in a file on a hard drive. It was alive, undeniable, playing out before the very people who could decide her fate. The cross-examination was brutal. My lawyer pressed her with simple, unyielding questions. Did you enter the hospital room uninvited? Did you touch the medical equipment? Why did you not alert staff when the alarm sounded? Karen tried to spin, tried to feign ignorance, claiming she only wanted to check on a neighbor in need, that she tripped, that she was confused by the machines. But with every excuse, the video contradicted her, replayed again and again like a dagger twisting deeper into her carefully crafted lies. The judge's patience wore thin. His voice grew stern, demanding direct answers, cutting through her web of evasion. The jury watched her unravel, her arrogance melting into panic, her once steady voice trembling. I could see it the moment she realized she had lost control. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, but found only the cold, unflinching stares of people who had seen the truth with their own eyes. By the time the closing arguments began, Karen's shoulders had slumped. The pearls around her neck no longer looked like a shield but a chain pulling her down. Her lawyer's words rang hollow, echoing in a room that had already made up its mind. My attorney's final statement was simple, powerful. You've seen the truth. A man's word can be doubted, but video doesn't lie. This wasn't an accident. It was an act of cruelty, and today, you have the power to make sure it never happens again. The jury filed out, and the silence that followed was suffocating. My hands shook, my wife's image flashing in my mind, the pale face, the shallow breaths, the monitor screaming for help. I prayed they understood. I prayed they saw what I had carried with me every day since that night. When the jury returned, the air in the courtroom felt heavy, charged. The foreman's voice was steady, but the words cut like thunder. Guilty. Guilty of reckless endangerment. Guilty of tampering with medical equipment. Guilty of endangering a life. Karen's face went white. She whispered something to her lawyer, her hands trembling now, her mask shattered. The gavel struck, sealing her fate, and in that instant, the weight that had pressed on my chest for months lifted. Justice had spoken. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, a swell of noise that blurred into the pounding of my heart. I looked at the judge, at the jury, at the screen still frozen on the damning image of Karen's hand on the cord, and I realized she had finally been seen for who she truly was. The woman who terrorized us, who tried to play God with my wife's fragile life, was no longer untouchable. For the first time in a long time, I felt hope. The word guilty echoed in my head long after the gavel struck. For months, I had dreamed of hearing it, but when it finally came, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like release. The pressure that had been suffocating me since the hospital dissolved, leaving me exhausted but lighter than I had been in what felt like years. My wife wasn't in the courtroom that day. Her health hadn't allowed it, but when I walked out into the sunlight, I swear I felt her presence beside me, as though justice itself had carried some of her burden away. Karen's expression as she was led out will never leave me. The smug confidence, the fake innocence, the tight smile she wore like armor, all of it shattered. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, stripped of the authority she once lorded over the neighborhood. The jury's verdict had done what no HOA meeting, no argument, no whispered complaint could ever do. It had unmasked her, and the world had seen her for what she was. The sentence wasn't as long as I might have wished, but it was enough. Community service, heavy fines, a criminal record that would follow her like a scarlet letter. The judge's stern lecture, captured by reporters who had picked up the story, echoed on local news broadcasts. Your actions were not those of a concerned neighbor. They were deliberate, reckless, and cruel. You endangered a vulnerable life for reasons this court struggles to comprehend. And now you will face the consequences. Neighbors who once kept silent began to distance themselves from her. Whispers turned into open condemnation. People who had once been too afraid to speak about Karen's harassment started sharing their own stories. Unpaid fines she had inflated, false complaints she had filed, intimidation she had spread. It was as though her downfall had cracked open the dam, and all the hidden resentment finally poured out. Karen went from self-appointed queen of the block to pariah. The HOA board quietly voted her out of leadership, stripping her of the power she had clung to for so long. Back home, the air felt different. My wife, though still recovering, smiled more easily, the shadow that had hung over her softening day by day. We could sit on our porch without feeling Karen's eyes drilling into us. We could plant flowers without fearing a complaint. Even something as small as taking the trash out felt like freedom. I hadn't realized until then how much she had stolen from us. Not just peace of mind, but the simple joys of living without fear. The footage from the courtroom spread further than I expected. Clips circulated online, snippets of the moment Karen was caught red-handed. Strangers commented, outraged at her cruelty, supportive of our fight. It was surreal to see people I had never met rooting for us, sharing words of encouragement, telling us that justice had been served. My wife read some of those messages during her recovery, and I could see how much it meant to her that the world believed her, that we weren't alone anymore. But victory didn't erase the scars. There were nights when I'd still wake to the phantom sound of the monitor's alarm, my heart racing, my chest tight. My wife sometimes grew quiet when we passed the hospital on the way to appointments, her hand tightening in mine. Healing wasn't instant. It was a slow climb out of a pit we had been shoved into. But at least we were climbing together, and at least the person who had pushed us there was no longer looming overhead. One moment stands out, weeks after the trial. I was walking past the community center where HOA meetings were held when I saw Karen across the street. She looked different, humbled, tired, her posture no longer commanding but hunched, her eyes darting away the second they met mine. There was no smile, no smirk, no clever remark, just silence. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt pity, not forgiveness, never forgiveness, but the recognition that she was no longer a threat. Her power had been broken. And that was the real victory. Not the fines, not the sentence, not even the guilty verdict. The victory was reclaiming our lives, our peace, our home. The victory was knowing that Karen could no longer bully us into submission, could no longer terrify my wife, could no longer twist truth into lies and walk away unscathed. She had tried to take everything from us, but in the end, she had destroyed herself. I sat by my wife's side one evening, watching her laugh at something on television, her color returning, her smile genuine again, and I realized something simple but profound. We had survived. Karen had wanted control, but we had taken back our story. And in doing so, we had won far more than any courtroom could give. We had won our freedom. When I look back on everything that happened, the part that strikes me most is how fragile life is and how quickly it can be threatened by something or someone you never imagined. My wife lying in that hospital bed, her life literally hanging on the rhythm of a machine, should have been the moment our community came together to support us. Instead, it became the stage for one woman's cruelty. That's what still shakes me. The realization that not every villain hides in shadows. Some live right next door, waving as you drive past, hiding their venom behind rules and smiles. But I also learned something else, something stronger. As much as darkness tried to consume us, truth was brighter. Proof, persistence, and the courage to keep fighting eventually tore down the lies. Karen thought her power was absolute. She thought no one would ever call her out, no one would ever stand against her. But in the end, it only took one act of defiance, choosing not to let her rewrite the story, to unravel everything she had built. Justice is never perfect. It doesn't erase the pain or undo the nights of fear. My wife still carries scars, both physical and emotional, from what she endured. I still wake some nights haunted by the sound of silence where a monitor's beeping should have been. But justice gave us something equally important. The assurance that cruelty does not win forever. The truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. And when it does, the impact is undeniable. I tell this story not because it's easy to relive, but because I want people to know that standing up for what's right matters, even when it feels hopeless, even when you're outnumbered, out-talked, or underestimated. Evidence, persistence, and a refusal to be silenced can turn the tide. If you're fighting your own Karen, whether it's an HOA bully, a manipulative boss, or someone who thrives on control, don't forget this. The truth will always be stronger than their lies. In the end, Karen didn't just lose in court. She lost her mask. She lost her grip on the community she tormented. She lost the illusion of power that she clung to for so long. And I gained something priceless. The knowledge that when you fight back with truth and integrity, you can reclaim your peace. If this story resonated with you, if you believe bullies should always be exposed, if you believe justice should always win, then I want you to stay with me. Because this isn't the only story I have to tell. There are more battles, more lessons, and more victories worth sharing. Backhand index pointing, right? So do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now, turn on notifications, and join me for the next story. Every click, every view, every new subscriber helps shine a light on stories that bullies like Karen hope will stay hidden. Together, we can make sure their kind of cruelty never wins again. Because at the end of the day, it isn't just my story, it's a reminder that none of us should ever be powerless.